of the skeletal system, they usually think of bone, and a lot of times you'll hear people say, "Oh, something's dry as a bone." Well, bone really isn't dry. If you ever buy a bone and steak, for instance, you'll actually notice that there's a lot of it actually has fluid in it. It's soft, not soft, but softer than the hard bone that we're used to. That dry bone that people are used to seeing, that they see, in a desert or something, or in a classroom, that dry bone is actually only around after it's been left out and dried out. Most bone is actually pretty wet, and it has a couple different functions to it. Now, the skeletal system goes beyond just the dry bone, the bones. One of the things it actually does include is something called cartilage, and something else, which are ligaments, which are made of dense, regular connective tissue. So I'm just going to draw a little bone here. So if we were to have a bone here, I don't know if let me see, rotate this so you can actually get a nice mark. If we have a bone coming down this way, we actually have bone on this area. And if we actually were to look inside bone, we'd see that there, I'll turn to the camera. If we were to look inside bone, we'd see that the area inside bone here is hollow. So we have bone here, which is hard and compact. And we have a soft area of bone behind it called spongy bone. And then we have a hollow cavity. Now, on top of bone, usually you'll have another bone. On top of bone, you'll usually have another bone coming on it. And so you have an area where bone and bone will rub together. To avoid that, what your body does is it puts an area of cartilage here. So we have a thin layer of cartilage. I'll put for cartilage. Then we'd have cartilage on this side here too. Now, that cartilage helps keep bone from rubbing against bone. If you don't have that cartilage, moving usually becomes relatively painful. On top of that, if you have really heavy things resting on, for instance, on the knee, you'll have another layer of cartilage over this to protect it even more. So if we look at our bone, we have bone. Bone's divided into the compact, spongy, and you have an empty cavity there. It's a medullary cavity. You have medullary bone as well. On top of bone, we have cartilage, which keeps it from rubbing together. Now, one thing you'll notice with the structure so far is that it's not really too stable. To stabilize it, what we've done is bone ends up, there is another tissue that ends up touching a bone, and then those are little connection pieces here, maybe here. You might have one coming here and here. And so what you have is you have these dense fibers holding your bones into place. These things are called ligaments. And ligaments are made up of a tissue called dense connective tissue. Now, dense connective tissue, you have two different variations. You have a dense regular, which is the one that actually would be holding a joint like this in place. And you also have dense irregular, which would maybe hold a joint like a shoulder in place. Both of them are actually needed for the body, and both of them have certain functions that are important. So we do have these different things going on: the bones, the ligaments, the cartilage. Now, when we start adding muscles to it, you'll also talk about the tendons. The tendons will also be made by dense, regular connective tissue. Now, I know so far it seems like a lot of vocabulary, but I just want you to get a basic understanding of this. Before I go on from this, I do want to mention something that a lot of people sometimes forget. And that's this. For this structure to maintain the strength, the integrity, and to actually function properly, it needs a certain amount of stress. What we're talking about here isn't the, oh, I'm stressed out because I forgot to study for a final. Over here, what we're talking about is stress due to physical stress. For those of you who are martial artists, I want you to think of your legs and how much stress is on your bones when you do something like Naihanchi or the Nikodashi. If you're a runner, think of how your body, the stresses that go on your body, on your bones when you run. Or when you first started running, think of getting shin splints. These are all stresses that occur in your body. And some of these stresses, if they are too much, can cause damage to different tissues. Now, what happens if you go the other route? What happens if you don't get enough stress on these areas? Well, they don't strengthen. And so eventually it makes it so minimal stresses can actually cause damage. But we'll get into that a little later. Now, as I do is what these tissues look like. And each one looks a little different based on its function. Now, before I talk about that, I am going to write on the other side here a couple pretty much root words. One of them is osteo. Anytime you see the word osteo or hear the word osteo, it refers to bone. We also have chondro. Anytime you hear the word chondro, it refers to cartilage. So bone, cartilage, and the other one is fibro. Fibro usually has to do with fibrous tissue, and usually we're dealing with the, in this case, dense regular connective tissue. It could be dense irregular. Now, if we have the word blast, there's another word that's important. And clast. Blast pretty much is a cell that builds something. Clast is something that tears something down. So you have osteoblasts, which build up bone, osteoclasts, which break down bone. And these things are activated based on your activity level. If you're constantly doing exercise where your bones are bearing weight, you'll activate more of your osteoblasts, making stronger, thicker bones. If, on the other hand, you're not doing anything, your osteoclasts will come in and start making your bones lighter and weaker. Reason that has to do with actually maintaining structures is pretty costly for your body. You also do have chondroblasts, fibroblasts, and so whatnot. Now that we have that, I'm going to end up with keeping this picture a lot, pretty much a long time. Concentric rings like this. Another side would have concentric rings, and we'd have another place with rings around it too. Now that's a compact bone. Within these areas, you do have the cells, and you have blood vessels going in there. Now, what usually happens when you make bone is you make these structures inside cartilage. You then make this arrangement, and then you end up having, I'm not going to use this one again. Then you end up having the bone calcify. Now, you have blood vessels. That means that if bone breaks, a lot of times the blood vessels can come and re-heal the bone. Usually what happens is you make a cartilage and then you make the bone. Now, if you notice, these look like trees. And that's actually really important for how it functions. First of all, they're pillars, and they are going to be going, not like this, but in the bone, they'll actually run up and down this way. Where they're going to be bearing weight is where you're going to see the circles like this. Now, how strong is this? Well, if you think about something like this, which is relatively thin and hollow, we can take this and put a coffee cup on it. We can also take a coffee cup off, take a big, nice book. You can see how big it is. By the way, if you're interested in an anatomy book, this is one of the ones I really like. It's Human Anatomy by Martini. And what you'll notice is it can hold a book and a coffee cup, even though it's that thin. Now, that's actually the structure of the microstructure of compact bone. Remember, it's solid there and relatively hollow in the middle with a lot of the spongy bone. So this actually could be the entire bone structure, not just the compact bone. Now, here's the thing is, as you can see, this can maintain a lot of force on this axial compression. But if we go to the side, it crumbles and bends. Bones rarely have a rare ability. Rarely do they have the ability to bend. If they bend, a lot of times what ends up happening is they break. And so, and that's why I put posters up, right? So, that's our compact bone. And I'm going to leave that there. I'm going to try to take this off by going around like this here again. Guess the pen's too good. Doesn't want to come off. So, if there's any questions, I will look every so often and see what's going on. And so far, it's just me talking alone. Now, that's your compact bone. And like I said, depending on how much you use it, it becomes stronger. If you don't use it enough, it does become weaker. Inside, we have spongy bone. And spongy bone really does look like a sponge. The advantage of having this hard, compact bone and the spongy bone is pretty much you now have a hard surface and a surface inside, which is a little more weavy. It actually, if you were to look at it, the spongy bone, it would actually have tubes going all over the place, and you'd have some cavities where you would have marrow or fat. And if you think about it, if you have those long cylinders coming out here, but then you have these arching, spread out, spider web-like connection of bone. What happens is, if this gets hit, the force can actually spread inside. So it's actually harder to break than most people would have. You know, even with the, there we go. It's harder to break than just the material. Now, I'm going to go into a little bit more of the material inside bone. I'm going to go into a little more of the material found inside bone. And I have one person, finally, yay. If you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. I actually have something that says I can watch the chat, so let me know. So all I did was talk about bone. You have compact and spongy bone. Compact tends to have these ring-like formations, and so it acts like a hollow cylinder. You can put a lot of pressure on it, but if you go to the side, it crumbles, breaks. The other thing is the spongy bone helps spread the force when it gets hit. And so that's actually one of the big things that's important with bone. So that's actually our bone. It's a hollow cylinder with different tissues around it. Pretty much a 5-minute overcap of what I talked about earlier. And we have another person. Thank you for joining us. Again, any questions you have, please let me know on the chat. I will answer. I am trying to do it live. So, and that's part of the reason is so you can actually ask the questions you need. So we talked about compact bone, spongy bone, and how you have a hollow cavity called the medullary cavity in bone. So you have your osteoblasts and osteoclasts. If we continue with this, I don't need this anymore. We can then also look at the cartilage here. Now, there are 3 types of cartilage. One of them is between bone and bone. Actually, it's also found in your ribs, by the way. It's called hyaline cartilage. So, hyaline cartilage. If you were to take a slide of it, what you see is these little holes, and you see an area which has a glassy appearance. Some people describe it as having a ground glass appearance. Now, the areas where you have the holes are called lacunae, and you have a little cell in there called a chondrocyte. Chondro means cartilage, cyte is cell, so you have a chondrocyte. Then that's one of the cartilage called hyaline cartilage. Well, that would be around the bone, pretty much around the bone here and here and here. And so it gives your bone a nice structure that it can actually rub against. Between the 2 hyaline cartilage, and if it's really high weight bearing, for instance, in your spine or in your knees, you have another type of cartilage called fibrocartilage. Fibro, again, same group. Fibro, it means fibrous. So you have a lot of fibers, and they're running in these parallel configuration. And every so often, you'll see lacuna. And inside the lacuna, you have a chondrocyte. And that tissue, the fibrocartilage, is a weight-bearing tissue. Now, remember what I told you about stress? I'm going to go back to that. So we have bones, cartilage, and they need stress to maintain function, but too much can damage them. Now, we also have a third type of cartilage, which is found in your ears. And if you were to look at it in a slide, it would look like wool. Right? It would actually have fibers running all over the place, a couple lacunae. It's called elastic fibers, and it is found in your ears. Now, one of the things that I will tell you is if you actually look at the bone tissue and you look at the cartilage, bone has a hole in the middle of it where blood vessels run in and out. So it does have really good blood supply. Cartilage, the blood supply tends to be around the entire tissue. So you have cartilage in the middle, and around it you have a what they call pericardium, pericardium. And around that you have some blood vessels. So that's how it ends up getting blood. But as it grows bigger and bigger, it gets harder to get the blood. Bone does have a periosteum as well. And I'm hearing all my neighbors today. And so those are the couple tissues that we find in bone. Now, the other tissue, I'm not going to use red again because I saw that mistake, is this dense regular connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue is our ligaments. And it actually is these bands. It's these bands of what's called collagen, cartilage. And inside you have fibroblasts. Cells that make fibers, they're dense fibers, are fibroblasts. And so we have our fibroblasts inside our ligament. Now, one thing you'll notice with the ligament is you don't really have good blood supply there. When I talk about how these things are damaged, that's actually why it's going to become important. So these ligaments do not have good blood supply. They can grow a little bit, but if they tear, it's really hard for them to heal. Cartilage has a similar thing. Now, we've talked about these, and I should also mention, around this, you do have a capsule, which is made of dense irregular connective tissue. You have a lot of times fluid in there, which is needed, synovial fluid, which is needed to help lubricate the joint as you move. But those are not tissues. Tissues, by the way, are the best definition I've been able to find is cells within matrix. And so now that we have the basics, by the way, this is the basics. If you take an anatomy class, if you get this book, for instance, they'll go into these cells and these tissues in a lot more detail. But for now, that should work. I'm going to actually erase this, and I'm going to end up with just the ligaments that I accidentally drew. I'm going to leave the words up. And let's see if this comes out a little better. A little better. Okay. But we'll get to that later. Now, let me ask this. I see something on that I didn't see before. Nope, no question. Let me ask you this. What are the main damages that people complain about, whether they're in some sort of sport or a martial art or dance? Is it actual injuries from falls, or are they injuries from training? Most of the time, when I've actually talked to people, a lot of the trauma a lot of the injuries they talk about are injuries that could have been prevented because they actually had to do with using the skeletal system in the wrong way. This is what I'm talking about. Everything needs stress. All the tissues that I talked about need stress to be maintained, to be stronger, but too much strain can actually cause fractures. Also, a misuse of the muscle of the bone can end up or tendon can end up causing fracture. It's not these big hits that usually ends up causing the damage, but rather repetitive traumatic events. What I mean by that is this. I'm going to start with bone because bone is the easiest one to deal with. And I want you to think of someone who is relatively healthy, going for a run, deciding to go for a run every day. Now, I want you to take that person and make a relatively healthy person who tries to go for a run the first time in their life. And I want you to think of how much stress is on their body, how much stress is on their feet, on their shins, on every part of their body. Is that any stress? Is that unusual stress for what we should be able to do as humans? And the answer is no. But a lot of times we do different activities. So when we switch it, it does make us use our bones a little different. So one of the things that can happen with bones is overstressing the bone can end up leading to something called stress fractures. Problem with stress fractures are, well, you actually have a break in the bone. And so when you get these, when you start feeling pain, you have to stop. You have to take a day off. Or if you continue this, you will end up doing permanent damage to your bones. There are a lot of people who actually, I remember there was when I was in medical school, we saw this one young woman who had stress fractures of the tibia because even though she was a runner, she decided to push herself farther and work past the point of pain. Now, most kinesiologists, most people who study exercise science, and almost every doctor will tell you, if something hurts, it's your body's way of telling you something's wrong, pull back. Now, that there are times when they tell you it's okay, but if you're doing something that hurts, make sure that you're doing that with someone who's trained in physical therapy and some sort of activity so they can actually keep you from having permanent damage. The other thing that people sometimes do is they don't align their bones correctly. If you don't align your bone correctly, one of the problems is it can do damage to certain sides that usually don't get any damage. What I mean is this. I want you to think of your long bone. Here, if it's used to having, actually, let me draw it up. If you have a long bone here, and it's used to having pressure here, but now you've actually changed it to now you've changed it so it's at an angle. This can actually act as a lever. By the way, all bones act as levers, but this can act as a lever in an improper way, which could end up causing breaks. So one of the big things that has to happen is when you are doing any activity, you really want to look at your bones, the total bone, and see if it's being used properly. The best way to do it is to get an anatomy book. A atlas is actually really good. I recommend Frank Netter's Atlas of Anatomy if you're interested. And that actually does tend to give you pretty much a view of how bones work. I would tell you, if you are doing this, go to a professional. Make sure you actually learn exactly what you're doing. So that's one of the things that happen when you misalign bones, is they act as lever, and they will act as levers in that area. Now, I want you to think of this. Think of how hard it is to take something and push down straight here. Think of how much easier it is if you put it at an angle here and just bend. That's, by the way, one of the big things that we do teach in martial arts. If you're using a bone a certain way, you don't want to take the hit straight here. You want to actually get it to go at pretty much at the axial compression of the bone. If you actually study some fractures, you can do that. There's a lot of fractures, and as there's no questions right now, I'll move on from that. Now, going to the other thing, cartilage. Like I said, you have cartilage in your ribs. They actually help help your ribs be able to expand and contract. You have cartilage in your knees and your elbows and your spine. Pretty much any joint will have cartilage, as well as in your ears. Now, cartilage does not have a good blood supply. So there's a couple different things that can happen. Sometimes we have people who are wrestlers or grapplers or even boxers, and they'll take a hit in the ear. And one of the things that happens is when you take a hard enough hit, it tears the blood vessels inside. The blood vessels around the perichondrium, and that leaks, causing the perichondrium to lift. And then it ends up forming more cartilage in that area where the blood clot developed. And by the way, that's how people get your cauliflower ears. And then that is cosmetic. It can be fixed. It can actually be prevented if it's actually treated immediately. Don't do it. I would actually say, and don't do it yourself. Make sure a trained professional actually cuts so you don't get an infection. The other thing that can happen to cartilage is a little, in my mind, a little more severe, and that is something called osteoarthritis. Osteo, we see it means bone. Arthro, there, means joint. So osteoarthritis means that in your joints, instead of cartilage, you replaced it with bone. Now, how do we do that? Well, a lot of people think you need a lot of trauma. But the truth is, there are people who get osteoarthritis from not the severity of the trauma, but the amount of trauma. I want you to think of using a power tool. You might feel the vibration in your hand. You might feel some irritation afterwards. But it's not a blunt hit necessarily that comes over and over again. Those constant vibrations, that constant trauma to the joints can end up leading to osteoarthritis. In martial arts, if you train in makiwara and you do not listen to your body, if you're constantly hitting something and you're feeling damage inside, you can end up giving yourself osteoarthritis. You have to, again, one of the big things that I would tell people is you have to listen to your body. And it looks like I did get one more person. Hello, and please ask any questions you have. I will go back if we need to. So that's actually one of the things with cartilage. If you use it right, it should last most of your life. If you don't, you can end up pretty much damaging and end up making it so you can't use certain things. Again, one of the things I like to tell people is training itself is not what's bad. Getting injured isn't necessarily bad, but the constant and repetition of injury, even minor injury, can end up causing pathological changes, can end up causing the pain that you will actually end up getting in the long term if you're not listening to what you're doing. The last thing I'm going to talk about, and those are your ligaments. Ligaments, as you remember, I told you, don't have good blood supply. Right away, you probably have figured out something. If something does not have a good blood supply, it will not heal well. What I mean by that is, if you don't have good blood supply, when something happens, it's not going to be able to get back to the original. Ligaments tend to have a big issue when injured. If anyone here knows anyone who's sprained an ankle, a lot of the ligaments there, or if you did a tendon, same thing, they will not necessarily heal so well, and you will actually have a repetition of the injury. You can, before it's injury, do some certain exercises. You can actually stretch. You can do some strength training, which can strengthen the tendons a little bit. The ligaments a little bit. But you have to be careful and make sure you don't tear anything. Now, how do people tear ligaments? A lot of people think, oh, you have to have some major force. And the truth is, as bones act as levers, a lot of times the force where it's applied tends not to be that great. It's actually how the force tends to be transferred. What I mean by that is this. There's a equation, math, what is it? I'm going to use this one here. Force equals mass times acceleration. If you have a lever here, and we have a little place here, then we're applying our force here. Our force coming up here has to be the same. Think of how the distance that this has to move to get a little movement here. What that means is this little movement here can end up having a lot of force, pretty much a lot of force acting on it because of this area here. That little area is pretty much going to be in trouble of breaking because this angle is used. Now remember, your bones are levers, and so a lot of times it is the lever being used in an improper way, accidentally. Now, I did talk about the three main families of tissues and bones. I talked about the Compact bone, spongy bone. I talked to you about cartilage and the three different types and where it's found. I talked about the dense regular connective tissue found in ligaments and also tendons. And I told you about how these things end up making more tissues. Now, I didn't go really in depth in this. I did keep it pretty light. If you are to take an basic anatomy class, you'll have an entire hour and a half lecture just on this, and then you'll jump into other things. It looks like I did get 3 people, but nobody had any questions, or I'm not doing the connection right. So I am learning how to do the live streams. I will tell you, everyone and anyone, I enjoy doing these lectures. To me, it's a lot of fun. I think sharing knowledge is one of my passions, and it keeps me from going overboard when I talk to people. When I talk to people outside on a social setting, right? The big take home is this: listen to your body, understand how your body works, and you should be able to maintain your life, your hobbies for a lifetime. Now, I will actually also mention something that I hear all the time. Many times people say, "Oh, well, yes, we have new techniques, we have new sciences, but people have been doing this for 1,000 years. These exercises, they were done back in medieval times." But one thing that people forget is in medieval time, life expectancy was about 30, 35. I think if you live past childhood, most people were expected to live up to 30 to 34. I think is one of the numbers I found. Most people were dying before they reached 34. Uh, and so a lot of times, the stuff that you can do when you're 34 is not the same stuff you can do when you're 40. And the stuff that you did when you were 34 will affect you when you're 40. And with new techniques, new information, we can actually make our martial arts something that can pretty much go on forever. Well, I want to thank the 3 people who are here. I didn't get any messages, but I'm glad someone decided to try to watch. I hope I was at least a little entertained, just a little, and that you got a lot out of this. I will edit this and put it online. And if you're watching this and after the live presentation, feel free to ask questions. I will continue answering them. And one of the things I would love to know is, why are people using this? Is it for their own personal knowledge and because they're doing physical exercise, or is it something else? For instance, if you're using this to try to supplement a class, hey, that's great. Let me know. So I will come off because now I'm just rambling. I hope you have a great day, great week, and hopefully in a month I'll do another one of these live. I think I may do pretty much a skeletal system, and again, this time it'll be probably the skull or something like that, and we can talk about how things break and why that's dangerous. So I should say again, have a nice day, and hope you enjoy this.